Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much to Diego for setting up this talk very, very nicely, actually, in illustrating the exponentially increasing demand of raw materials that we're all subject to at the moment. This little scheme reinforces that if we look to the EU designations of criticality as they've gone through time, the more we've looked at the issues, the more problems we've identified and the more challenges. So we have a widening array of bulk and technology metals that are causing concern. And another little scheme, another infographic to show that interplay of global and local factors that actually impact access to raw materials. So this scheme looks at the production of coal, copper and lead, and antimony as a function of the onset of the Yugoslav wars in 1991, where essentially on this exponential graph, there were huge impacts, though graphically they don't appear very big, on coal, copper, lead production, and antimony production stopped completely as a critical raw material. And so that's where it couldn't withstand the local perturbations that impacted supply. But that was because it was on a backdrop of increasing production in China. And what we see prior to the mid-1980s is actually that antimony production was pretty well spread globally and actually within Europe as well. So there's a lot of material in the ground that we have access to regionally, but this combination of local and global challenges that impact manufacturing locations has resulted in a number of strategies. And of course, most countries have those strategies: US, Japan, China, Russia, Korea, everywhere. But the UK and the EU strategies and act are actually quite closely aligned, that we have to think about the supply chains, but that we have to think more clearly about what we have local access to in the case of supply chain perturbation. And so ultimately, we need to expand the geography of production, thinking about our international supply chains, but bringing mining closer to home as well. And if we're bringing mining closer to home, we have to think about what resources we actually have on our doorstep. And so the global solutions to access to raw materials are place-based. They're place-based in the international context, and they're place-based in the local context. But following on from some other talks that we've seen as well in the last two sessions of this meeting, there's ongoing work to enhance best practice to ensure that we can ramp up supply locally using those local resources. Obviously, that's to varying success depending on the jurisdiction in which mining is operating. And we heard a lot yesterday about how that relates to the competence of mining projects. And really, we need to think about when is enough enough? When is it economic enough? When does the geology that we have regionally fit the global economic paradigm of where things can be ramped up and brought online at a relatively low unit cost of production? And what doesn't happen? What happens when our geologies don't fit that economic global paradigm of producing the lowest cost raw material? So we need to think very carefully about how we reorient the global and the local. And that leads to some very interesting ideas about where we can access raw materials. And there's a different set of ambitions and a different set of ways of viewing risk, depending on whether people think beyond the global or whether people think local. And so there's the two classic examples of going global are that of deep sea mining and of production out of this world in space. And in some cases, we're seeing deep sea mining getting going already, though not in international waters. But the really important voices and narratives that are coming out now are that when you look at this from a mining perspective, the deep sea mining and the global extraterrestrial kind of beyond the fringe kind of exciting ideas inhabit a really high risk culture in relation to health and safety of workforces and operations, but also of the environment and society globally. And so we need to really think about looking beneath our feet. What have we got access to that can be accessed safely at a lower risk kind of scenario? So we did a project. It's a bit of an old project now, and people who know my work will have heard about this quite a bit. So I want to skip past some of these slides quite quickly. But between 2016 and 2020, we did a project looking at small deposits in Europe and how you could ramp up production from those. This map shows where there's lots of gaps of data, but that there's also an awful lot of small deposits that have been recorded across Europe. And we tried to ramp up production at a lead bulk and antimony critical metals, a couple of mine sites in Bosnia and Serbia in that 4-year program. And so that's just an infographic of the groups that were involved in setting up a whole mining value chain, because we recognize that one innovation on its own might fail to make any kind of impact at all in how we view mining. So we went from small scale cutting tools in A to a small scale containerized ore sorter B, comminution circuit C, and a gravity-based processing plant in D, which has a much, much smaller footprint than this tiny corner of the full plant that was under production at the first underground mine since the Yugoslav wars. So really, it was an experiment to look and see how easy it is to resolve a whole mining paradigm, understanding that small-scale mining does operate globally for gold deposits, but that it doesn't operate very well for critical raw materials and for a diversity of commodities. So what does it take to really make small-scale mining a more attractive option? And if we just sort of think a little bit about some of the outcomes of those experiments, we've got some pictures of the cutting tool there, where we were using that and it was designed to reduce the primary crushing needs of the ore deposit, and how we reduce transportation of materials and energy through using this kind of equipment. But the results of the limits to automation that we found were that there were some implications, so that we recognize that large-scale mining is intensive in capital investment and it removes workers from danger, but it also removes positive benefits from the community. In small-scale mining, we have low capital investment, and so we can't afford all those automated structures, but we also haven't got as much knowledge of the complex geologies, so that we actually need to be able to respond to changes in the ore deposit quite quickly. So we need to be able to read the rock more clearly. We need to be able to have some skilled labor to manage the cutting tools and techniques. And we need rapid cut-off safety controls in place. So this is really important, because it means that we need to change the narrative to move forwards With development of mining systems, we need to reduce workforces and increase automation. It changes that narrative to focusing on safety culture maturity. And certainly in the project, we did sort of talk a little bit about that, but the spin-offs from this 2016 to 2020 project, we're still trying to write up a huge body of literature that's been generated from that. So we'll hopefully see some more publications about safety culture maturity relative to scales of mining. Okay, we also did life cycle analysis. I'll run through this pretty quickly because we're short of time, but the throughputs, the lower throughputs, the lower energy and water consumption, and the lifetime of equipment that's containerized were built into the functional unit of life cycle analysis. We did that environmentally and socially. And the environmental results with a number of metrics, two key takeaways are that toxicity related to equipment and waste management can be understood for small-scale mining, just as it can for established large-scale mining. And the need for a suitable electricity demand and supply system with relation to the carbon footprint is also really key. And we modelled that as well, thinking about the spatial footprint of raw materials, the renewable energy vectors that we have in different parts of Europe. And the really, really important thing is that for all our modelling, for all site locations across Europe, the optimum energy generation for a small-scale mining plant does not include diesel generators. And yet, diesel generators are still being used. So there's a real need for behavioural changes and changes in business modelling. With the social impact hotspots that were identified, the real key takeaway from the message was that a lot of the impacts weren't necessarily being felt at the mine site itself, because we built a lot of our infrastructure in the UK and transported it outwards. So the value chain and the way that the supply chain is connected up is really important about thinking about where and how big different impacts are. And the impact of climate change and flooding or fire events is all there as well. What also came out from the social science aspects about risks and perceptions of small-scale mining related to societal expectations of labour. So there is a feedback loop between automation, safety and labour there, which is really, really important. But that local public perceptions of scale of mining aren't recognised at all. So any prior experience of large-scale mining is taken forward into attitudes towards small-scale mining too. So the risks in the eye of the beholder are very different from the communities to the industrial practitioners. And I hope I'm going okay for time, but I've just got a couple more slides. So some new research that's coming out now in recognising that small-scale mining does operate globally, in recognising that small-scale mining is not ubiquitous with artisanal mining in the global south. There's been recent research done by Cassia Johnson about global north small-scale mining, going from artisanal all the way through to medium-scale mining in the Yukon, has been really, really insightful. Thinking about what it is that supports uptake of small-scale gold mining and how dynamic formalization and regulation can actually work to support small-scale mining operations, but that the economic structures for reporting act in contradiction to that, so that there's need for internal or alternative investment mechanisms to suit those small-scale operations where the output is not constrained by demand, but constrained instead by the owner-occupiers who have an expectation for living in a sustainable environment. Those structures of dynamic formalization and governance are not available equally globally, and Cassie will be writing up her research in Ghana as well to show how the orgeologies can impact whether environmentally sound technologies are adopted or not. And so there are some underlying geological constraints on whether that can happen, but also whether the system is geared to support miners to adopt technologies. So we have to think about, where is small-scale mining practice going to be adopted or impeded, particularly in relation to a wider range of commodities. So some unpublished stakeholder analysis that we've done, that hopefully we'll get out soon, is about where responsibility and risk for innovation lies. And for small-scale mining, that lies ultimately with small and medium enterprise technology providers, not with the mining users who would gather the greatest economic benefit from innovation. And so it's really, really important to recognize that there needs to be some resilience amongst the technology providers for how to do that. So the example I've got up there is where multiple applications can mitigate some risk. So Metal Innovations, the company that developed the cutting tool I showed earlier, have actually used it as a tunneling tool since, because take up by the mining industry is very slow. And so where can they actually develop their business model to manage that slow take up? The other real issue is that development costs of sustainable and adaptable solutions are very high relative to the unit sale costs, which is a very risky business because of a small market and low take-up. And so this is where open innovation and working with the research institutes really helps to support those small and medium enterprises. The other problem we've got listed there is that it's not the responsibility of the mining company to actually show that an innovation is suitable to that mine site. The requirement for proving feasibility also lies with the technology provider. And so take up by mining companies can be very slow indeed. We find that that can be combated somewhat if we appreciate the value of the social and economic drivers, and how we actually build that into policy is really, really important, and how that can act to stimulate change. That's really important. So the necessary innovation cluster that we identify, or as Andy Reynolds put it, the model, the idea, needs to be really all-encompassing and extending beyond the technological, embracing the business models and the socio-environmental and open innovation research policy relations as well. So what's happening that's quite nice, that's moving forwards, that I wanted to flag, is the United Nations Resource Management System that's been created. And this provides a toolkit. This has been done by, this particular infographic is by Eva Marquis, working with Francis Wall, to develop a toolkit where we see that the competency of the company, the degree of geological confidence, the technical feasibility, is married very, very proactively with the economic, environmental, and social viability in a model of strong sustainability that builds in transparency and collaboration as well. So the rollout of this, it's been trialled in Cornwall in the southwest of England. It's being trialled next in Zambia, I think it is, and then we'll see how more widely it's rolled out. But this will work across the scales of mining, and that I see as quite an important innovation. So just to summarize a few takeaway messages, is that if we think place-based, we can de-risk to some extent global security issues. For small-scale mining, it is operating internationally, but to extend that to a wider range of commodities, to reduce criticality, to bring mining closer to home, there's quite a lot of paradigm shift that's required. And we need to do that thinking in a whole system across all of these jurisdictions. But there's some really, really exciting things that are happening and some businesses that are really trying to enter this sphere for critical raw materials. But social innovation for development and enhanced environmental performance should be able to reduce those barriers towards uptake of new technologies over time. But the policy and community expectations are a really, really important part of that. So I don't know how I'm doing for time, but hopefully we've got some time for questions, and I will stop sharing.
Kate, thank you so much. As always, absolutely fantastic. Round of applause, everybody, for the fabulous Kate Moore. Brilliant. Now, Kate, we are running a little bit short on time, and but there are a few questions both in the chat and also in the Q&A, which I'll let you answer. Just one question that has been coming through from a number of areas is, okay, so we've got the technology, we know how to do it. We've got the demand for those minerals and materials that this form of mining can extract. What's the blocker? Is it that large-scale mining kind of model that's constraining us, or what is stopping us from getting these smaller scale mining models actually rolling?
Well, there's not one thing. That's the real key takeaway. There's not one thing. There's investment. Is that there's not a long return on investment. So yes, it's not an attractive proposition to a professional investor when there are other mines that can be invested in. That's a really, really key takeaway. That's really important. Permitting is huge. And if it's close to economic viability, what happens and how do you build the model that builds in mine closure for a short duration project? So those are really key critical things. And if you don't have adequate information, how do you actually get all the permits in place? So for a short-term mining operation, if you have long-term permitting issues, that's a real blocker as well.